Okay, so our next session is India's G20 moment, shaping the global energy transition and climate change. I'd like to invite on stage our panel members for this session, Mr. Amitabh Kant, India's G20 Sherpa and former CEO of Niti Aayog, Government of India. Professor Kelly Sims Gallagher, Professor of Energy and Environment Policy, Fletcher School, Tufts University. And Dr. Navroz Dubash, Professor Initiative on Climate, Energy and Environment at CPR, who's also the moderator of this session. Over to you, Dr. Dubash.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session. I'm really delighted to see such a full house. And we've had a wonderful day's discussions, and I hope that, and I'm actually very sure that this panel will add to the quality of the discussion. Before I introduce the panelists, let me just sort of take a second to try and set the stage a little bit for what we're hoping to talk about today. We heard yesterday from Professor Adam Tooze about the polycrisis that we are facing, and he asked the question, well, what then does it mean for India to have a moment? What is the nature of this moment that India faces? And it's a challenging moment, for sure. And we've talked all day about the various crises, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in Europe, about the climate crisis, about the Russia-Ukraine situation, about energy security, a food crisis, and so on and so forth. And into all of this steps India as chair of the G20. It's a challenging moment, but it's also a moment with the potential for creative opportunities to try and reframe debates and discussions. And so we thought it was useful then to have a panel today to discuss just this. What is the nature of this moment, and how can India seize it as chair of the G20? Now, the G20 is a large and complex process with many, many agendas. It is going to be dominated undoubtedly by the Ukraine-Russia situation. But there is also a slow-brewing crisis that has been going on for quite a while, which is the climate crisis, and discussions around the energy transition. And so we thought today we would focus the conversation on the role of India in the G20, particularly with regard to the energy transition and the climate crisis. So why is this something that's worth discussing right now? Well, in the midst of all the other things we're facing. Well, for one, we have seen this year climate disaster after climate disaster, most recently and perhaps most dramatically with our neighbor, Pakistan, with 1/3 of its land underwater. We've seen that the normal dynamic of global diplomacy around climate change has become ever more conflicted, with developing countries perhaps asserting themselves more and more, saying, look, you're asking us to do ever more. We don't see any money on the table, and we actually don't see enough action coming from you. So the politics are getting increasingly conflicted. We now have a story of growing concerns about energy security, in part driven by the Ukraine-Russia crisis. But we also see dramatic changes happening in technology and in costs. For example, renewable energy costs have fallen 80% in the last decade. Storage costs have fallen also about 80% in the last decade. And renewable energy, in many contexts, is now cheaper than fossil fuel energy, raising the possibility of a fast-moving energy transition. So under all these circumstances, a sort of mix of largely problematic news and some glimmers of good news, the question is, can developing countries both grow and be green at the same time? In fact, can we grow by being green? And under what conditions, right? Now, one doesn't want to be sort of Pollyanna-ish about this. It's not easy to do this, but is there a set of circumstances where developing countries can provide for the aspirations of their people while helping to solve the climate crisis, while tunneling through, in a sense, this energy problem to a world that actually is more competitive, creates more jobs, and is also cleaner. We also have new ideas in the political firmament here in India. The Prime Minister has talked about livelihoods for sustainable development. So this life metaphor, the idea of behavioral change and whether or not we can bring that about, and that's an idea that we can take forward to the world community. And so both on the side of energy demand as well as on the side of energy supply, there's a lot of ferment going on. And the question then becomes, do we have scope in the G20 to really take forward this conversation as a nation? So with us today to explore this set of issues. I think we have an incredibly well-qualified panel. Let me just briefly introduce both of you. Normally we say X and Y doesn't deserve any introduction, but then when you have these kinds of accomplishments, I think people should have a chance to bask in them every now and then. So I am going to list a few. To my left, at the end of the panel here, is a very well-known figure in India, of course, Mr. Amitabh Kant, who is our G20 Sherpa. He is the former CEO of Niti Aayog. Also very important for this kind of conversation, he was the secretary in the past of the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion. And a lot of these conversations are, in fact, about industrial policy. And he's written, among other things, 2 books with words that you will see on billboards and that you've heard: Incredible India 2.0 and Branding India, An Incredible Story. So thank you very much, Mr. Kant. I know you're just off a flight from Jakarta, so we particularly appreciate your presence. We also have with us Professor Kelly Sims Gallagher from Tufts University. And Kelly is both the academic dean at the Fletcher School right now, but nonetheless finds lots of time for her academic work. She is a professor of energy and environmental policy and also directs the climate policy lab there. She also straddles the policy world and in the past has been in the Obama White House, I believe in the Office of Science, Technology and Policy, and also the China advisor to the US State Department, where, among other things, I think she was one of the people who was instrumental in brokering the US-China deal that came out right before Paris, or a year or so before Paris, which I think was quite a significant moment. And Kelly also brings a lot of work on innovation, which I think will be very useful here in the India context. So welcome to you both. Thank you both. Kelly, of course, has made an even longer journey, but has had a day or so to recover from the US. So really appreciate you both being here.
This was longer, as it turned out.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Well, longer and shorter recovery time. So, but nonetheless, I'm going to pose the first question to you, if that's all right. So I thought we might just embark on this and make this as conversational as possible. So, Mr. Kant, maybe you can start by unpacking this G20 process for us a little bit. To what extent is there space, actually, in such a complex process for India to pursue any agendas, let alone an agenda that perhaps risks getting crowded out by other urgent things? And in what ways is India thinking about using the G20 to take this forward?
So thanks, Navroz. First of all, it's a very fractured world. The various challenges. By the time India takes over the presidency of G20, to my mind, global growth would have been badly impacted. We'll probably have a recession across Europe and probably America as well. The Fed has already taken a lot of action in terms of sucking out liquidity. It's working against inflation, and therefore dollar is going to get strengthened. Global supply chains are disrupted. SDGs have got severely health, education, all these learning outcomes, all of them have got impacted during the COVID period. And more than that, climate action has taken backstage. You have a scenario where Germany has gone back to fossil fuel. It's restarted its coal plant. Japan has gone back to fossil fuel. So this onward march towards energy transition has got badly impacted. I think clear implication of all this in the shorter run will be that Europe will get hugely impacted as a manufacturing destination simply because the energy costs have risen very substantially, partly on the automobile side, but hugely on the chemical side. Hugely it'll get impacted. Its competitiveness as a manufacturing destination will get impacted. But I always see every crisis as a huge, huge opportunity. And therefore, by the time India takes over, I think there's an opportunity to be aggressive, to be ambitious. And I think only those who are ambitious will win the battle. So my view is that this is an opportunity for the world. This is an opportunity for G20. If you don't act now, then G20 has very little meaning. This is an opportunity for G20 to bring a huge acceleration on SDG center stage, because if you want to transform the world, G20 is ideally poised because United Nations is too large, too diffused a body. It's proved to be totally ineffective during the Russia-Ukraine war or on climate change. G7 is too elitist. G20 is just the right size of body. It accounts for about 85% of the global GDP. It accounts for about almost 78% of the global trade. It accounts for about 2/3 of the population, global population. So it's just the right size. And if G20 has the political will and the political leadership to drive SDG implementation center stage or to believe in climate action, this is the opportunity for G20 to really drive it, to bring in radical change. This is the moment for G20.
So, great, thank you. It's wonderful to hear that you see a big role for the G20, even in this sort of situation. Can I bring Kelly in and ask you, given your, I can give you this one if you like. In this, given your engagement in international processes of various sorts, what kinds of gains do you think the G20 can bring? What kinds of collaboration can it foster? What, among the various things that need to be done, what is the G20 best suited to bringing about?
Well, as I think about the global energy transition, I think there's three big components to that. The first component is that each country needs to devise a low-carbon, resilient development strategy. Second, you need a policy framework in each country to create enabling conditions. And then we need capital. And capital, or another way of putting this, another term we use a lot is climate finance. We need to really mobilize climate finance as if we were really trying to do that rather than setting somewhat artificial targets that I think have been done repeatedly in the context of the COP negotiations. And we need global cooperation really around each leg of this stool. And the G20 is particularly well suited, not only for the reasons that Mr. Kant just mentioned. It's all the right constellation of countries in terms of their economies, but also in terms of emissions. But it is traditionally been a forum where global financial rules and norms and standards have been established. And so I think it's the right place to do that. Up until now, the G20 has been, with respect to the energy transition, largely been focused on stopping things. Stopping fossil fuel subsidies, stopping the financing of overseas coal investment. And I think one opportunity would be for this G20 to take a more positive framing and thinking about what does it want to fund? What does it want to support? What will be the new low-carbon development strategy in each of these countries? And maybe each of the G20 countries could put forward their own nationally determined commitments on climate finance. What will they commit to in terms of domestic finance behind low-carbon development strategies? And then what would they commit in terms of overseas investments? And the capacities will differ, among the different G20 countries. It's a very diverse set of countries. So what we might expect of the United States would be very different from what we would expect of Indonesia, for example. But I think every country needs to start thinking about the positive commitments that it's ready to make to rebuild the economy and get us back on track to achieve the SDGs.
So Mr. Kant, can I bring you in to comment on that? So in a sense, I think this is a very nice framing that the G20 has historically been sort of stop, and now it's kind of how do you reframe that into kind of a, firing the starting on a set of measures to take forward from stop to go, in a sense. How feasible is that? I mean, in the sense that the G20 has often taken this kind of line that we are implicitly scrutinizing what different members bring to the table. There's a sense of, calling each other out a little bit. How feasible is this kind of positive, virtuous cycle dynamic, something that one can develop within the G20? And maybe make this a two-part question. If, in fact, as I think Kelly said, the first part of this is a low-carbon strategy, do you see India coming to the table with something cogent and concrete domestically on what we're ready to do? Now, of course, there are many very, very robust individual measures, but have we knitted into a strategy yet? And do we need to do that as a prerequisite to take this forward to the G20?
So let me start with the second part of your question, because India was amongst the rare few countries which achieved its NDC targets assigned at COP21 in Paris. We achieved about 110 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel. Now, to accelerate the pace of this, it's very important to understand the dimension of this, that we are not, the emerging markets are not responsible for the polluting the world. If you were to look at the total carbon space available at 1.5 degrees centigrade out of the 2,400 gigatons of carbon space available, for instance, India has occupied only 1.5%, whereas logically, on a per capita basis, it's entitled to 18.5%. So 1.5%, it's logically entitled to 18.5%. But irrespective of the fact that it's not contributed to polluting the world, which the developed world is, and climate justice principles have been agreed to at various COPs and in G20, irrespective of that, India feels that climate action is a huge opportunity. It's not a challenge, it's an opportunity. And therefore, India should accelerate the pace, and India's commitment, both at COP21 and COP26 in Glasgow, where Prime Minister committed to Panchtantra, are really a step forward. And in India's context, it's important to understand that while we hugely accelerated the pace of our renewable energy, electricity is just 20% of our energy. It's very important to understand this, that even if you do 100% renewable energy, that'll be just electrifying 20% of your energy. So you need to get into deep decarbonization of your hard-to-abate sectors, which is, you need to get into refinery, you need to get into steel, you need to get into cement, you need to get into fertilizer, you need to get into long-distance transport, which are not run by electricity. They are hard-to-abate sectors, and therefore you need to decarbonize them. And to decarbonize them, you need a green hydrogen strategy. And that green hydrogen strategy is possible in India because you've been able to bring down the cost of renewable very sharply. Now, when you look at the cost of renewable and you want to make India the production and technological hub of green hydrogen, India has an advantage because it's climatically blessed. It doesn't have competition from China on that. It's climatically blessed. Its entrepreneurship is top class, really, truly top class, particularly the younger generation of it. But India has a challenge, and that challenge is that the cost of financing, the interest rates are very high in India. It's 11 to 12% versus 1 to 2% in other parts of the world. Now, the developed world has been committing to financing this transition in the name of climate justice, which was agreed to from 2009 in Copenhagen till now. It is not provided that financing. And I'm quite sure that the way it's going, don't expect anything from the developed world. They'll talk. From COP21 to COP26, the developed world has not lived up to a single even one single commitment. And at every COP, the developed world looks for a long-term goal. It doesn't talk about short-term goals. And therefore, in 2049, they will propose a 2080 agenda and not live up to its commitment for 2050 net zero. And therefore, I don't expect any progress forward from the developed world at all. But what is important is that many of these multilateral institutions which were created in the post-Bretton Woods period, the post-World War II period, were not designed for the post-COVID and the post-climate action agenda of the world. And therefore, these, whether it's World Bank, whether it's IMF, they all do direct lending. They still do direct lending, whereas they should be converted into financing arms of the world for SDG and for climate action. Now, even so, that would imply that they should get into blended finance, they should get into first loss guarantees, they should get into credit enhancement, which will enable them to do 20x more lending than what they do right now. And that even the political will for restructuring these institutions, and I'm not talking about quotas and I'm not talking about equity structure, I'm talking about changing the nature of the working of these institutions to provide lending to emerging markets for climate finance and for SDG. Even that is not happening. And that shows a total lack of political will by the developed world. But to my mind, I see India, if India is to accelerate the pace of its growth, India must accelerate the pace of action on climate action. Because valuations and capital will get attracted towards companies which go digital and which go green. And therefore, much like we've driven the digital acceleration movement in the world, and we've created our digital public goods, and we are far ahead advanced than the developed world, we should be ambitious enough to be far ahead advanced with the developed world in climate action. And India should be determined to do that irrespective of the developed world not providing it, living up to its commitment.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, clearly you've struck a chord here, which is always good. And I think it's, we can come back to the question of the G20, but let's pursue this second part of the answer a little bit further. And I think you're absolutely right, that in a sense, part of the challenge we see in the last few years, particularly since the emergence of the 1.5 target, is you had a Paris Agreement machinery that was a learning by doing machinery that has then been truncated, where there's no time to actually learn by doing. They're saying, hurry up and sort of accelerate action, even though we haven't seen that level of action in the West that really was necessary in order for India and developing countries to be able to access carbon to meet our energy needs. But at the same time, as you said, climate finance, understood as public finance, the $100 billion, is not only not materializing, it's just not going to do the job. So the kinds of things that you've talked about, such as reform of the MDBs, might be a more productive conversation. And Kelly, maybe you can come in on this, and do you think that route is something that is productive? You've also heard about, there's lots of talk about the money that's sloshing around in the big US pension funds, and how do you mobilize all these mainstream sources of finance? What will it take to actually bring those sources of capital to these shores? And how feasible is it, given that it's not just India, but many other developing countries that are, in a sense, being told the same story? Mm-hmm. So we're competing among ourselves for those sources of capital. How feasible do you think this is?
Well, first of all, amen to multilateral development bank reform. Yes. I think that's just a no-brainer, and I've been writing forcefully to advocate for that. But I don't think we can stop with the MDBs, because there are really significant bilateral investment flows that go directly through public finance or policy banks. And I've done a lot of work looking at China's overseas development bank lending, particularly in the energy sector. And there's a lot of potential money there. And I think, to my earlier point, China is one of those countries who should be supporting clean energy transition overseas. It's capable of doing that. It has financed a huge amount of energy infrastructure around the world. Xi Jinping himself pledged to step up support for clean, renewable energy. But so far, we have not yet seen that manifest through the China Development Bank and China's Exim Bank. And likewise, very slow start for the U.S. Development Finance Corporation and other, I could go on. So I think we need to look at MDBs, but we also really need to hold countries accountable for their bilateral investment flows and get them to step up and honor their commitments. This is really an accountability problem, but I also think it's like we're not even really trying. If we were really trying, to remake our economies and really support low-carbon resilient development, we would have already reformed these institutions, and we would already have focused on what does it take to steer private capital as well. I think there's a lot of work to do on the regulation of commercial banks. Each country can be doing that domestically. We have, almost no accountability for that in any country right now. So I think there's a really big agenda in this domain that needs to be addressed. If I can just add one other point about all these pledges. I wrote an article last year, about a year ago, called The Net Zero Trap. And my concern, the sort of thesis of that argument is that each year we go to the COPs and everybody makes announcements. It's just turning into an announcement forum. And people make pledges, particularly long-term pledges. And that, takes the pressure off of current leaders. And then there's no accountability against those long-term pledges. What does that current president or prime minister need to do to actually get the country on track, right? Or to help developing countries get on track. And we could just be trapped forever in this sort of long-term pledging arrangement and never get on with the important work of low-carbon development.
I definitely think all three of us are in violent agreement on that point. I think I've also written that in a sense the regime is turning into a tell us what you're going to, tell us what you say, not tell us what you do. It's more important that you set a target than you actually implement action in the short run. So I think that's very, very true. But I want to come back a little bit and push a bit harder on this finance point. In the past, we have had this dynamic around climate finance, which essentially said, look, this isn't aid. This is essentially money to help us globally get out of a problem that is of your making, right? And therefore, it needs to be public money. India has made this case repeatedly. I think the reality is that many of those economies are not going to be in a position to mobilize the public money of the scale needed. And so therefore, we are not now talking about more creative instruments. There's this language now around just energy transition programs for countries to finance their coal transitions, packages put together in part by the multilateral development banks led by the South Africa example, the kind of blended finance that you're talking about, bilateral donors as well as the pension funds. The challenge, however, when you move to that space, is that that is not money that in any conventional way follows the kind of aid logic. It is money that is going to come because there is a good bet to be made. And so then we're back in this situation where they say, okay, well, show us that your bet is credible. Show us that your strategies are worthy of us making the leap and entering new spaces. And so the onus then perhaps shifts back to us, but that might be the situation we're in. If we think that it's in India's interest to make this leap to a low-carbon future for reasons that might have to do with things other than climate change, because it helps create jobs, because it helps address air pollution, because it creates more livable cities, we then have to create a package that is reasonable, that is credible, that is defensible, that is sustainable of policies. Is that way of thinking about things how we are approaching this? Is that an appropriate way of thinking about this, or are we missing something here?
So, no, Bruce, first and foremost, the principles of it has been accepted in COP, that the developed world has been responsible for about 85% of the carbon space it's occupied. It's responsible for polluting the world, and therefore the principles of climate justice state that they support emerging markets to transit. Because if the world is to move towards 1.5 degree, it's not possible for it to do it without India's transition towards net zero. Now, if India was to do that, my view is that the developed world should live up to its commitment. I'm not saying that it should not live up to its commitment. It must live up to its commitment, which is made in 2009. It's not doing that. And secondly, your multilateral finance institutions are not doing that, and you're not restructuring. You're not playing a leading role to do that. My personal view is that in the long run, the vast amount of private pools of funds are available, institutional money is available. That will flow in for companies which are going to go green, and actually this movement for a green world of tomorrow will be driven by the private sector. But that would necessitate that we are able to digitize the extent of pollution. For instance, 1% of the companies on Wall Street account for 49% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, how do you ensure that that is digitally calculated, monitored? You have an organization like Moody, which does the rating for credit enhancement rating, does the credit rating for companies which are polluting the world. And then you get punished by the market. The market either provides you incentive or it punishes you. That's the long-term gain. Long-term proposition is digitization of carbon emission, rating by an agency, putting it in public domain, naming and shaming each one of these companies and each one of these countries which is polluting the world. The West has got away, and the Western companies and the multinationals have got away with it for far too long. Now, that's the long-term plan. In the short term, to enable transition to take place, how do you decarbonize? You may have the climatic condition, but if you were to look at the last bid of India for renewable energy, which we got at ₹1.99 per cent, that's about 2.7 cents per kilowatt hour. Saudi got 76 cents. We calculated the differential. It was nothing but interest rate. Now, if India is to accelerate the pace, the government doesn't need money. We need money for young entrepreneurs to be able to do that transition very rapidly. But what the Western world is doing is just doing greenwashing. Greenwashing and saying that we are financing your green transition, whereas it's supporting transition which is not green at all. So my view is that there has to be a political will in the Western part of the world to be able to do that green transition. Second, very important point is that it's not countries which are going to make a difference. It's going to be individuals and communities which are going to make a difference. Countries will go around making pledges, as what Kelly has talked about, at each one of the COP, and they'll never be able to live up to it. So it's individual and communities which must lead this change for a movement. And that change will come when there's a huge, what Prime Minister has talked about is lifestyle for environment. That is, the Western world must change its lifestyle. You go to New York, you go to Boston, you go anywhere, all lights are on 24/7. There is no change in heart of the individual or the community in the Western part of the world. They continue to pollute the world like they were doing yesterday. What is the will? What is the individual commitment? And therefore, if 1 billion people in the Western world were to reorient their lifestyle, they will be bringing down the greenhouse gas emission by 20% in the world. And that's a huge amount.
Well, thank you. I think I'm really
so
glad.
Behavioral change, nudging individual behavior, what these Nobel Award winners, Carl Sustain and Thaler have talked about, that's very critical in the Western part of the world. It's not important in the emerging market, but it's important in the Western part of the world. The behavioral change must take place.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
So first of all, I think it is happening in some places. It's just really uneven. I mean, even in the United States, I can tell you, certain states have had really dramatic reductions. In my own state, we've had a 52% reduction in electricity emissions. And I think a lot of behavioral changes, but then it's totally offset by other states. So I think that's something that needs to be said. But I also really want to give agency to developing countries. And I think in work that we have done in the Climate Policy Lab with developing countries around the world, what we see is when developing countries are able to articulate a low-carbon development strategy, when they're able to devise industrial policies, when they're able to state clearly and create policy conditions, we actually start to see MDB investment flow, and most importantly, private capital flow. And I think the real money is in the private capital. Obviously, right? There's so much more money in the private sector that can flow. So I go back to what I said at the beginning, that a crucial step is for these developing countries to get their policy environments right. Because if there's incentives for deploying, say, wind and solar, I think that the money will start to flow. And I think India has a really great opportunity to actually forge this new low-carbon development model for the world. Look, like if you were, I don't know, I don't want to pick any particular country, but we've been doing a lot of work in Ethiopia. If you're Ethiopia and you're looking around the world for a viable development model, where are you going to look? I think so far they've largely looked to China, but the China development model was a super carbon intensive development model. Yes, it was very effective at reducing poverty, but no, it was not good from a climate point of view. You look at the American development model, flawed in many ways, and also a very carbon-intensive development model. So a new model needs to be forged, and we need to find role models. And I actually think India's at the cusp of forging that low-carbon and resilient development model. And that would be a really important thing for India to try to articulate at the G20 to be the beacon, that other countries could begin to follow.
No, thank you, Kelly. And I think it actually nicely complements what Mr. Kant was saying. And if I can kind of wrap those two comments together and turn it back to Mr. Kant. So certainly, I think all of us who travel to the developed world sometimes marvel at the profligacy of the energy. It's not marvel, but we're sort of astonished at the profligacy. And there's clearly scope for that sort of behavioral change. I think, of course, it depends. European consumption patterns are a bit more modest, for example, than the US, and so on and so forth. But there's another part to this, which is that behavioral change often requires complementary measures, right? It's not just up to the individual. It's much easier to walk somewhere if you have a decent pavement, or to take the bus if you have a decent public transport system. And so infrastructure incentives complement behaviors. Now, the question is, if we are taking seriously this life metaphor for behavioral change, then there's a really interesting story here, the story you just told for the developed world, but there's also the story that Kelly was starting to say for the developing world. How can the G20 become a vehicle for propagating this idea for both the developed and the developing world? And in the case of the developing world, it'll have to wrap in the idea of appropriate infrastructure development, how we build our cities, for example, to make for less mobility needs and greater public transport, and so on and so forth. Is that kind of meta construct something that India can take to the G20 and successfully?
So G20 is a grouping of nations. For that to happen, the G20, especially the G7, must realize that the development model was flawed. When they were urbanizing, their car companies bought over the railway companies and destroyed them. America has 1,100 cars, 1,100 cars per 1,000 people. Europe has 920 cars per 1,000 people. India has 22 cars per 1,000 people. So their entire urbanization was driven not for people of America or the people of Europe, it was driven for car manufacturers. Now, India has the advantage because we are not yet fully urbanized, and therefore we can technologically leapfrog into a new model of urbanization, which will be cycling, walking, which will be public transport driven. And therefore we are accelerating the pace of our electrification of two-wheelers, three-wheelers, public transportation, and we are not providing subsidy for cars under our FAME scheme. India has the advantage because in the next 5 decades, you'll have 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization. And therefore, you can make cities which are, where you can do walk to work and which are meant for public, which are driven on the back of public transportation, not on the back of car mobility. India has the advantage because it can drive many of these new cities with actually renewable energy, which it has huge advantage of. So India can do that. India can be the first country in the world to drive much of the decarbonization through green hydrogen and become the center, the production and technology hub for green hydrogen. You can be the world's biggest producer of green hydrogen. You can become the world's biggest exporter of green hydrogen. You can become the world's biggest exporter of green hydrogen and ammonia. You can bring down the price of green hydrogen from $4.5 per kilogram right now to about $2.5 by 2025 and bring it down to $1 per kilogram by 2030. And that is what the country's ambition is. And the Prime Minister in his Independence Day address said that we import worth about 180 billion worth of fossil fuel, and which will double by 2047, but we want to be totally free from fossil fuel import. And because we want to do that, that means we'll have to bring the size and scale of India to transit towards green hydrogen strategy. India can be the first country in the world, and be the first country in the world to urbanize and to industrialize without carbonizing. But for G20 to do that, India will be the first country and India will do it. But for G20 to do that, a lot of political capital has to come in from the developed world, which is very badly missing.
But just to take it one step further, what would it take for India to further this agenda through the G20? Would it take allies? Would it take, do you see those sorts of allies on the horizon? Do you see space to bring this agenda in? What concrete would it be, sort of tying this to MDB reform? What are the sort of concrete things that one could do?
So my view is, first and foremost, is the reform of the multilateral financing institution. That's critical to my mind, very critical, because you can straight away ensure that large-scale resources start flowing in not through direct lending, but through credit enhancement. You need institutions like MIGA, etc., to be far more functional. You need a complete restructuring. I'm not talking about equity and shareholding, etc., but the nature of working of IMF and World Bank to radically alter to assist this transition towards green. That's for a short-term goal by G20. The short-term ambition of G20 will be a big achievement. I'm not talking about structural change. The appetite of the Western world for deep-seated reforms is totally absent. So for a short-term ambition, that's a good enough goal.
Thank you. That's very helpful and very specific. Kelly, I wanted to bring you in to also maybe pivot a little bit away from the G20. We're entering, yet another COP season, the Climate Conference of Parties. That's going to be in November, right around the time India takes over at the G20. And these are often moments when we see the appetite for international cooperation. We see if there's sort of, flashpoints, conflicted moments. This is one COP that's going to be held in a developing country, in Egypt. And it looks like some of these questions around finance, the fact that some of the developed world is kind of pivoting back to fossil fuels, the growing evidence of catastrophic climate events, these are all going to be sort of at the backdrop to the COP. Can you give us a little bit of a read on this COP and what you think it'll add to this conversation, or ways it might make the conversation either easier or harder?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know as well or better than me, the COP process can be agonizingly slow and maddening. And then one day or 1 year, you suddenly have these breakthroughs. And I think there's a real art to trying to figure out how you can create momentum and catalyze and find those ways of breaking through. And that was one of the things we tried to do with the US-China deal before Paris, was to take these historic enemies, in the climate context, who had essentially played a game of chicken, saying, I'm not going to do anything until you commit to do anything. And both countries were doing that. And one of the things that I recognized from my years of working in China was that China was already doing a lot. And nobody in the United States understood how much China was doing. China had really begun this big, industrial transition in terms of investing in, clean energy industries. think of what China's accomplished, in solar and in wind and in electric vehicles and lithium-ion batteries. And, all of that work started in the 2000s. I mean, it's relatively recent, but a lot had happened. And so I thought China was actually ready, to make a bigger global commitment. And likewise, for a variety of political reasons, Obama having hit his second term. I don't see this COP as being one of those COPs where we're going to see a breakthrough. What I expect is a lot of frustration, justifiable frustration articulated from developing countries about the lack of finance that's been forthcoming. This has been, we tend to be kind of absorbed by this war and Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but it's been a really tough year in terms of climate impacts. Whether we look at the flooding in Pakistan, the extreme heat in India, massive, the United States, I think this is going to turn out to be our most expensive billion-dollar disaster year, especially now that we just had the Hurricane Ian. But across the world, we're just seeing increasing levels of climate damages. And it makes you wonder, once again, why aren't we taking the preventive action? As the costs start getting worse and worse and worse, the investment potential of, avoiding all of these damages is really important. So I think we're going to hear a lot about what's known in the climate negotiations, loss and damage, the fact that many developing countries are experiencing a tremendous amount of straight-out loss. And demand for climate finance. I'm just skeptical about the COP process's ability. It's the wrong people. The wrong people are coming to the COPs. It's not the finance ministers who are going to the COPs, right? So I'm just skeptical that that is the right forum for us to solve the climate finance problem. I think the G20 is the right forum to solve our climate finance problem. And that's why I'm so excited that India will be taking the helm, because I know India understands the importance of this, not only for mitigation, but also for adaptation, how important it is to protect vulnerable countries. And, I think it could be a signature achievement for India if you're able to solve the problems that we can't solve in the COP context.
Well, I think, sadly, I probably share your somewhat pessimistic interpretation, though I do think that the fact that adaptation issues and loss and damage issues are going to be on the table in a serious way will be something quite interesting. Would you like to come in on the COP point? I had another direction I was going to take the conversation before we open it up, Mr. Gant.
No, my belief is that irrespective of the COP, India must take the lead. And it's important that India must technologically leapfrog. There are a whole range of new technologies emerging on battery storage, from solid state to metal air to many other. And many of our startups are doing that. And we must, many of our new companies, new age companies have done that. The new technologies emerging in renewables, from tandem to bifacial to many, direct to wafer, which will enable you to technologically leapfrog. And similarly on mobility, path-breaking new technologies. India must technologically leapfrog. You have the entrepreneurship, you have a startup movement, you have the dynamism of the Indian economy, which is growing at 7.4% plus. India must become a leader. India must decarbonize, not for COP26 or anything, COP27. We should do it for ourselves. We must become the leader like we've become the leader in digital world of, we are way ahead. We've done in 5 years' time what would have taken India 50 years to do. We must do the same transition in climate change for ourselves and for improving the lives of our citizens.
Right. No, so I wanted to follow up on exactly that point in two ways, actually, and maybe after that we'll open it up. As you say, India has, particularly in the last few years, been very vocal in using this language of climate change as an opportunity to transform our economy and so on and so forth. Of course, we also use, as you did when you opened your remarks, the fact that we haven't really contributed to this problem as a global problem at anywhere near the scale. So, 4% of global population, 70% of global population, just 4% of cumulative emissions, for example. And so that way of looking at the problem is looking at it as a climate regulation or a carbon regulation problem. The other way, looking at it as an opportunity, is looking at it as a low carbon development challenge, right, with attendant opportunities. And in a sense, I think I sometimes feel in our pronouncements publicly, we oscillate back and forth between these narratives. And I wonder whether a narrative that says, look, we firmly buy the opportunity story, but we don't want to be sanguine about how easy it is, nor do we want to be in a position where our energy is constrained. Therefore, because we didn't cause this, if we need to use our fossils for a certain period of time, we will, because we need the energy. But we do buy the opportunity story at the end of the day. And I wonder whether that sort of narrative is how you see what India will take to the G20. That's sort of the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question, I think you spelt out very convincingly, all the things we've done, the vision of a hydrogen future, the vision of low-carbon cities, the fact that we have an opportunity not to lock into those things, the fact that we have these entrepreneurs, we do have high-cost capital, which is a shortfall. But there's one thing you haven't mentioned that I'd love you to talk a little bit about, and that goes back to your time, really, as CEO of NITI. Sometimes from the outside, we get the sense that the system nature of these transitions, the fact that you have to look at electricity and transport and urbanization together, these are things that within the government of India, the institutional bridges haven't yet been built to think in the system way about this transformation. And so you might have, a production-linked incentive here and an embryonic carbon market there, but we haven't really seen these things being knitted together. And one of the things I've learned from talking to Kelly is the importance of packages of policies, not just individual policies, but thinking about how these policies are knit together. Is this a direction, and this is a challenge, right? Very few countries do this. Certainly most of the wealthier countries don't do this either. But is this a direction of travel? Is this a kind of conversation that's growing in the government of India? How do we best support all these entrepreneurs? How do we actually get them what they need in terms of regulatory support and system support?
So the broad vision has been set by the goals laid down at COP26 in the Panchamrit pronouncement of the Prime Minister. But if you were to look at it in terms of individual sectors, look at the FAME 2 policy for the transition in mobility, transport sector. Look at this production-linked incentive scheme to push for battery manufacturing in India. We had called for bids for 50 gigawatts. We got bids for 130 gigawatts. That was the response. Look at the shift from towards PLI for solar transition from manufacturing, integrated manufacturing here, which has been further enhanced by another 19,500 crores. And look at, again, the mobility where we've announced that we will do PLI not for combustion vehicles, but only for electric and, the greener forms of transportation. In fact, the PLI scheme for automobile was altered at the cabinet level to say that it'll only be for electric and new age technologies. So greener technologies. And look at this huge thrust towards biofuels. From 1%, we've achieved 10% of ethanol in just 2 years' time. So it's been path-breaking. The transition in India has been truly spectacular. It's been path-breaking. And what we've achieved in renewable energy in terms of 110 gigawatt. And look at what young entrepreneurs have done. I mean, the kind of entrepreneurship they've demonstrated. I mean, look at companies like ACMA or Greenco. They are like the cowboys of the world, the kind of transition that they're doing. So it's unbelievable what's happening in India. It's only Indians who do not realize the vast scale of transition that is taking place. But the transition has been immense. It's been just spectacular in India. And it's mind-boggling to my mind what's taking place in India. And over a period of time, you'll realize that the acceleration has been just phenomenal in India.
Well, perhaps if Indians were fully satisfied and didn't question, we wouldn't be fully Indian either. So,
You're always welcome to question. My job is only to respond to questions.
absolutely. So, and that's a wonderful note on which to turn it over to the audience. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's start with the lady in the back there, in front of the. No, you're turning backwards, but I'm looking at you. And yes, that's right, in the middle. And then the gentleman in front of her, and then Daljit, and then we'll do another round on this side of the room.
Sure, so I'm just going to get to it. It's a very basic question, basically. I wanted to know that here we're a lot of intellectual people and a lot of curious people who want to talk about G20 and COP and everything. But how do we bring this change about the hydrogen energy and moving to clean energy in rural areas that comprise 50%, more than 50% of the population in India? So do you have any policy initiatives that we could take in order to achieve that goal? Yeah, that's that.
Okay, thank you. That's one question. The gentleman with the mask.
My question is to Mr. Khan. So do you see the role of International Solar Alliance as a new kind of financing body or some sort of emission tracking, like you were saying? So can India take lead in developing this kind of new kind of multilateral organization by International Solar Alliance?
Okay, thank you. There's wonderful two models. Daljit?
This question is for Mr. Khan. Mr. Kant, it's great that India is making.
Start grilling Kelly.
I will. Actually, I do have another question for her, and I'll be short, brief. So it's great that India is making rapid strides in decarbonization. But we don't seem to be doing enough, or we're doing very little on adaptation. And I think the floods in Pakistan should really be a wake-up call for us. Could you say something about what India plans to, what the government plans to do? And Professor Gallagher, just very briefly, what is being done to address the, in this mad rush to add RE, which I think is wonderful, but what is being done to address the environmental and social impacts of this very rapid introduction of these new technologies? I'm talking about all the mining impacts that are going to happen. Do we even have enough of those minerals? And the mining impacts in places, it might be in other places, Chile and the okay, and filling up of landfills with used PV panels, etc.
Okay. Thank you. Since you've been very brief, let's take a fourth right here next to Daljit.
Yeah, thanks. Mr. Khan, you mentioned about innovations in climate. So I'm curious to know what are these innovations which could happen? Like in the digital world, it was DPGs, digital public goods. Do you is there some innovations which are already happening and which the government is working on? And what are the opportunities to pursue them further?
Okay, thank you. Let's start with Mr. Kant and then come to Kelly.
In response to the first question about rural areas, I think it's important that to look at the whole ecosystem. It's not just the rural or the urban areas. It's the model of growth that you want to pursue and the model of urbanization that you pursue. Because quite often we start looking at it in piecemeal, which is not the right way to look at it. We've done a lot in terms of providing electricity to every village or providing huge amount of LED at low costs and so on. Or recent procurement of about 5,950 buses for rural areas where the price of the buses were lower than the combustion buses. This is the largest tender in the world, incidentally, on electric buses. We've done several things, but it's important to look at the entire picture in a comprehensive manner, because quite often we don't realize that a huge amount of urbanization will be taking place in the years to come. And when you talk about 500 million people getting into urbanization, that means you're talking about making 2.5 Americas in 5 decades. Now that is, you can keep doing unsustained, unplanned urbanization, which you see when you drive from here to Rajasthan. It's all unplanned, unsustainable urbanization. You'll do vast amount of energy consumption if you don't do it on the back of public transportation. So all these areas when we make roads in rural areas, how do you provide electric mobility to those areas? How do you ensure that microgrids are created in these areas, on which a lot of work is actually happening? So I think it's important to look at what is going to happen in the next 3 to 4 decades and how to shape the trajectory of that in a manner which is climate friendly. And that is, to my mind, a very critical thing, rather than saying that what we are doing for rural areas. You need to take a larger comprehensive picture. That's important. And so that bit is about rural India. And what is the second?
ISA is the second question.
So ISA should never get into financing. It should just become a great intellectual institution. It should be able to provide great intellectual inputs to the world as far as solar energy or green hydrogen. It should be broadly have the best technical skills. It should be an institution which should be able to drive energy transition for many of the emerging nations of the world. That is critical to my mind, rather than financing. It can't take over the role of World Bank, IMF into financing. It doesn't have the resource base to do that. And it should never do that. It should be just a good R&D arm, a good knowledge spreader. It should be an agent of change, and probably do a few pilot projects in some of the emerging nations, particularly in Africa. That, to my mind, is critical.
Adaptation.
So adaptation, yes. Mitigation and adaptation, I think lot has been attempted to. It's not that lot has not been attempted. Lot is being attempted to, but I think we need to accelerate even more, far more. But, one point I really want to talk about, and that is that if you look at the new policy which America has come up with, and I'm saying this because a lot of people in our country and some leading intellectuals talk about production-linked incentive scheme being a subsidy and so on, which it is not. It's about enhancing production, making size and scale to production. I mean, if you look at the new policy which America has come up with on hydrogen, it's a highly protectionist policy. It's giving $3 per kilogram of subsidy support, $3. $3 means if the cost of production today is $4, you're providing $3 of subsidy for every single drop of hydrogen being made in the United States of America. It's totally protectionist. And so one should realize where the world is heading for. I mean, there's huge amount of, behind this talk about free market economy and everything, there's a law. In the policy framework, there's huge amount of protectionism which is taking place.
Make no mistake, the United States is finally embracing industrial policy. I think that creates an opening for many developing countries to embrace it themselves. There's no excuse anymore for the United States or others to criticize that. And I do think it's needed, whether it's in, green industry or industries that are not carbon intensive. Those are part of the, low carbon economy of the future. If I can come back to the question about renewable energy in rural areas, I think every single dollar or rupee spent needs to be as strategic as possible to exploit both mitigation, well, 3 things: mitigation benefits, adaptation benefits, and developmental benefits. And we tend to think of these as one or the other, either development or mitigation or adaptation. But there's so many examples of where you can achieve synergistic benefits. And I think no country is doing that well yet today. So think about, the farmer who needs access to electricity, maybe to run a water pump, to provide irrigation, which would provide adaptation benefits, and probably make, the farm more productive, which would be highly developmental. That's a synergistic approach, but we tend to not think about it that way. And money is scarce, as we've been talking about, so we don't have the luxury, to not think more smartly and strategically about how each public dollar, at least, is being deployed. On this question of, all of the components in the clean energy revolution, so to speak, you know, I think the green economy is going to be a very different economy. You know, a renewable energy future, if that's where we're going, is going to be totally different from a fossil fuel-based in terms of the geopolitics of renewables. We're going to be looking much more at regional energy markets because our renewables are unevenly distributed, so you're going to need to use electricity lines to transport from, you know, windy areas to population centers or sunny areas. But the other component of this is where are all the critical, you know, rare earth minerals and other minerals. And those are not evenly distributed around the world either. And I think we need to put a lot of thought and effort before this gets out of hand, right, into what are the supply chains going to look like? How are we protecting the social and ecological rights of those regions where these rare earths and other minerals are being developed? This is, I think, another good thing for the G20 to think about, setting standards, creating norms. This should be part of the MDB reform for making sure that this new industrialization, so to speak, you know, doesn't create more harm, ecological harm, and social harm.
I think it is a actually very important emerging agenda. I just want to reflect that I think both of you talked about, you know, and I think Mr. Kant put it this way, that we have to think about how you shape development that is climate friendly, which is both resilient and low carbon. And in a sense, it reinforces the fact that climate change isn't an issue out there anymore. It's an issue that's actually baked into our choices about how we develop. And that's what makes it both sort of an opportunity, but also quite complex.
Navroz, it's very important to understand that your companies, your private sector enterprise, and countries, both, will not be able to attract capital without being aggressive.
Correct.
And being climate ambitious. Your valuations of companies will not go up. I mean, you can go back and look at the NSE index. The valuation only of companies which are going green, which are going digital, is going up. So if you want to grow at a rapid pace of 9 to 10% per annum, you can do it if you technologically leapfrog both digitally and by being very ambitious about climate action. That's important for both countries and for companies.
No, thank you. Okay, let's get questions on this side over here. So let's start at the back there with the very last hand.
Okay, hello. My question is to Mr. Kant, and it pertains to India's G20 presidency. So we have assured, or rather say that we will focus on global south issues, for example, debt relief. So, sir, given the fractious geopolitics of the time, how do you think we will be able to address an issue as dividing as debt relief for the global south? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please. You were first off with your hand up this time. So in front, Pranav, right here. The lady who's standing up.
Hi, good afternoon to the panel. I'm Avantika from CSE. My question is for Kelly. So given that a lot of civil society is talking about loss and damage being the headline issue at COP this year, and also if there isn't a reasonable enough agreement, it might lead to a failure of COP. Historically, the US, the EU have been blockers in this process. So based on your understanding of current US climate politics, do you think the US has shifted its position at all? Will it be willing to arrive at some kind of compromise, come to the negotiating table? I'd love to hear your views on this. Thank you.
Okay, at the back there, Pranav, I'm going to make you walk up and down all the way at the back. Yeah.
Thanks, Navroz. I just want to circle back to the adaptation conversation. So it's a three-part question to Mr. Kant. The first bit is
3 short parts.
Very short. What do you think about a national adaptation strategy? Like, how can the center backstop the states? That's first. The second is circling back to the institutional conversation. Which ministry is best placed to handle the adaptation file? Because it's a cross-sectoral problem. And the third thing is international. is there a way we can use adaptation to unlock the loss and damage conversation at the G20? Create some sort of adaptation coalition or something.
Okay. Even though this is a full plate, we're going to take one final question. Yes.
Right, so just a pointed question. So historically, whenever we've seen energy transitions in India, there has been a lot of infringement of land rights of indigenous communities. So what structures have been put in place during this ongoing energy transition that was vastly pointed out in this lecture? What structures have been put in place to ensure that these infringements do not occur this time around?
Okay, thank you. All right, maybe we'll start with your question this time, Kelly, and then you can comment on the others as well.
I'm afraid I don't have a really good answer to your good question. I think loss and damage, this is just my personal, I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of the United States. My personal view on loss and damage is we all need to recognize that there's tremendous loss and damage occurring around the world. That this was my earlier point, right? If that's not obvious to everybody by now, you're blind. The question is, what is the remedy? And I think that the way this has been framed up in the context of the COP is difficult. It's very difficult. I would love to just break through it by focusing on finance for development, finance for mitigation, finance for adaptation. I mean, this is sort of the thesis I've been advancing, is that we need to be financing low carbon, resilient development models everywhere. And I hope India can pioneer it. I think that is a more constructive framing. That is something that the United States could get behind. And I will certainly be advocating for the United States to get behind it, to be using its voice and votes in the MDBs, and to be accelerating and stepping up its financing through its bilateral finance institutions and aid institutions. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kelly. Mr. Kant?
I think there was an important question on the debt issue. And, because of the COVID, several LDCs have been very badly impacted, and that's a very important question. And I think during the Saudi presidency, on the behest of our Prime Minister, several measures were taken as far as debt for the LDCs were concerned, and I think that's a major concern for many of the countries, particularly if during our presidency, looking at the impact on the developing countries, we will bring that issue center stage. But I think the important issue will have to be, the critical issue will have to be to accelerating the process of growth for the world. That, to my mind, will be the real challenge for the G20 at that point of time. On climate adaptation and whether center should backstop states, that's a full question with many subparts to that question. So I'll be very happy to discuss with you offline, but I just want to say that India is a very large country. It's very important to understand this. We are bigger than 25 countries of Europe, plus another 30,000 kilometers. Every state, one of the challenges on climate action and where we are and what it is leading to, every state has to become a leader. And actually, we must start ranking states, much like we've started ranking states on ease of doing business. And one day we ranked Gujarat #1, and next year Andhra beat Gujarat, and the third year Telangana beat Gujarat and Andhra. But the good thing was that Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, which are mineral-rich states, jumped up to 4th and 5th position. I think we should start ranking states on climate adaptation and climate action. And, because the real action on India is with the states, not with the central government. We are a very vibrant federal polity, and therefore the states must take leadership. And a lot of work in extension, mass communication, etc., has to be done with the states. So I'll be very happy to discuss with you, and I'll be very happy to welcome all your suggestions on this and on how do we take this in a much more vigorous manner. I welcome your inputs on this, and I'll be very happy to discuss with you offline on this. So please give your inputs on this. And anybody else here, a lot of young people sitting here who are very key players on energy transition and on climate action. Any inputs from you is very critical to our thinking as far as both G20 and climate action is concerned. So please, let me have your views and inputs. I'll be very happy to take them forward.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mr. Kant. We do have some briefs now that you ask on climate federalism, which we will share with you. But I did also want to flag, there was one question on land rights, which possible land rights issues tied to renewable energy, if you could address.
Sorry, I didn't respond to that, but that's again a very, very, very important question. It's a very valid and a very fair question and a very important question, and that's something that we, when we take climate action and when we push for climate mitigation and adaptation, I think equity must be at the heart of it. And much like we say that when we are driving growth, energy transition is to be at the heart of it. When we do climate action, I think fairness and justness for everyone and equity has to be at the heart of this transition. And I'm personally a great believer that we have to take the community along. I've always believed that climate action can never be successful without making individuals and community a very key player. Communities have to lead it from the front, and therefore I emphasize the significance and importance of the states, panchayats, local bodies, self-help groups, all of them have to be key players in this. Without that, this will not happen.
Thank you. That's a wonderful note on which to end, and I think that the more we can internalize climate equity at home, it also makes it a much more powerful amplifier of our voice overseas. So I just wish to thank Mr. Kant, Professor Gallagher. Both of you have traveled to be here and battled jet lag very, very successfully, I might add. And I want to thank the audience. As Mr. Kant said, lots of young people in the audience, and one of the things we really pride ourselves on at CPR is really having this kind of open platform where you can interact with policymakers and decision makers in this unvarnished way. And thank you for being very attentive and for asking great questions. So, Mr. Kant, Professor Gallagher, thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause?